Hello, my U.S. history students. I am bringing you some presentations again this week. We're covering two topics, the Depression and the New Deal, and the second topic is World War II. Both of these come in two parts. So for this one, the first part is the Depression and the New Deal, and the second part of this lecture is the Second New Deal. Um, and also there are questions that go along with these, so you need to be filling them out as you're listening/watching to these. The questions for these lectures are in the Google Classroom. All right, so let's get into it. All right. All right. So the Roaring Twenties were a very prosperous time in the United States, but little problems start to occur. And eventually it really begins, the Great Depression begins with Black Tuesday, or the day October 29th, 1929, when the stock market crashed. But again, there are little problems that are starting to pop up that cause the depression. One of them is overproduction, which means the factories are making too much. They're making more than people are buying, which doesn't seem like a big deal, but if factories are making too much and people aren't buying, then they're not getting a profit. They're not making money. And so this means that maybe they have to lay off people or they have to fire people, which then means that people can't buy food and they can't support themselves. So overproduction is a bad thing. In an economy, factories only should produce enough that people will buy. They don't want to produce too much. Um, Another problem is people are buying things on credit, which if you have a credit card, you might be familiar with credit. And credit is just like using other people's money, which is fine if times are good and you can pay people back. You can pay the people whose money you are using. But again, during this time, people start to lose jobs, and they can't pay, the companies or the banks or whatever. They can't pay back. So this becomes a problem. Something else that happens are farmers are struggling, right? Crop prices are falling, and so the poor farmers can't make any money. Another thing is speculation, and this really has to do with the stock market and stocks and the value and the price of stocks. So if you think about it, stocks are like a balloon. And if you put too much air into that balloon, it's going to pop. So that's kind of what was happening. People were just pouring all their money into stock market, which sounds like it's not such a bad thing, but it was driving the prices of the stocks up. And stocks are really a reflection of how well a company is doing. So if everybody is buying stocks, stock market, stock prices are going up, you might think, oh, the country's in a great place, the stock market is doing well. But really, those are inflated and they're not realistic of how well a company is doing. Um, so the stock market is driving up prices. Things might look good, but really, if factories are closing, if they're laying off, um, then the reality is that the companies aren't doing well. And so you have just like the balloon pops with too much air. If people are driving up the prices of stock, but in reality, the companies aren't doing well, then they, the stocks, people sell them or the stocks just are worthless. Um, okay, so another problem is bank loans. So people maybe who have lost their job can't pay their mortgage, can't pay the bank. Maybe factory owners borrow money to help build their factory or buy machinery or equipment. So if factories are losing money, then they can't pay the banks back. And banks are businesses. And if they're not getting their money, they're going to go out of business. Another thing is another problem for the Great Crash and the Depression. A cause of the Depression is foreign debt, right? World War I just finished, and countries in Europe are struggling and they're not paying back the American government. And so if we're not getting money from other countries, then that's going to really hurt our country. All right. Another problem that happens is the Dust Bowl. Um, so again, farmers not in a really good place, right? Because their prices are dropping. So they're not making money. And if they're not making money, they can't afford to pay for all the new technology that's coming out. So again, farmers were buying all this equipment and all this machinery, but the prices of the crops are dropping and they're not making money, so they can't pay for their expensive machinery. Another problem was the Great Plains, kind of like the Midwest of America. If you think about it, the Great Plains was a lot of grasslands, and those grasses were holding on to the soil, right? They were keeping the soil from blowing away. So as the farmers tear up that grass, there's nothing to keep that soil in place. So the soil is blowing away. Another problem is the farmers just kept planting the same crops over and over and over, and they weren't doing what we call rotating. So just changing the crops, changing different crops. Maybe one year they're planting corn and the next year they're planting wheat or barley. So that damages the soil if you're planting the same crops over and over and over. And if you're depleting the soil, that means you're drying it out and it's just going to blow it away. There's nothing to hold it there. So again, the farmers aren't being very responsible. They're tearing up all the grass that's holding the soil down, and then they're planting the same things over and over and over, which is destroying the soil. You also have droughts. Droughts are drying up, the soil because there's no water. And so as a result, farmers are losing their farms and they have to move. And you might have heard the term Okies. It's a very derogatory term. Again, it's not a nice term. It was referring to people from Oklahoma who lost their farms and were moving west to find jobs and support their families. Here's a picture. You can kind of get a good idea of how fine the soil or the dust is, and you can't plant anything. Nothing will survive. So this was part of the problem during the 30s. This is also a time when African Americans and women are losing their jobs. Because if you remember, a lot of African Americans were moving north to the factories, and when times are hard, they were losing their jobs. They were losing their jobs to the white workers. There was also this idea that, oh, you were the last person hired? Well, guess what? Unfortunately, you're going to be the first to get fired, right? It's like the last in, first out. And again, factories were closing because they were making too much and people weren't buying their products. Sharecroppers and tenant farmers, remember, a lot of poor African Americans after the Civil War were becoming sharecroppers and tenant farmers. Well, because of falling crop prices, they are losing their homes, their livelihoods, because they're getting kicked off the farms. Because remember, they're just renting the land or they're giving the people who own the land crops as payment. So unfortunately, again, sharecroppers and tenant farmers are really hard hit. Some women were lucky enough because they were able to find jobs as teachers and nurses. But for the most part, if a factory owner had to choose between a man and a woman, they would choose the man because he needed to feed his family. All right, so Herbert Hoover is out and Franklin D. Roosevelt is elected president. he comes along with his New Deal, which was based on a lot of progressive ideas. And we didn't get into progressive movement very much, but the progressive movement really wanted the government to help people. It wanted the government to control the economy. It wanted the government to come up with social welfare programs. They weren't very popular earlier, but now that people are struggling, these ideas are really what people want and what Franklin D. Roosevelt is trying to do to help the country. He's coming up with all these progressive ideas and laws and legislation. And again, it's to really help the people in this time of need and to put the country back on track. I'm just going to go through these really quickly. You guys can pause and read them. But the things that the legislation or the laws or the ideas that he came up with, one of them is a bank holiday, which would prevent people from running to the bank and taking out all their money. Because that was also a problem people would do. They would run to the bank and withdraw everything, and if a bank doesn't have money, then it collapses and it goes out of business. There's the Emergency Banking Act, which the federal government starts to loan money to banks to help them keep afloat and keep them in business. There's also the government creates the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, which is to provide families with food and clothing and just basically help them out. And yes, I have food twice. All right, and there's also the Civilian Conservation Corps. So this was just the government creating all these jobs to hire people. And it's to hire people to plant trees and build road and work on river flood control. So that the rivers don't flood and people lose their homes. So again, this was the government's attempt to just create all these jobs to hire people and so that they would have money and be able to survive. The government also creates the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which basically paid farmers not to plant crops. And it also bought livestock from the farmers, like cows and chickens and pigs, and just slaughtered them. And the idea is by not paying farmers to plant crops, you will drive up the prices, and then farmers will not be so poor. And again, if you're just slaughtering the livestock, this is going to drive up the prices and help farmers. The government also comes up with the National Recovery Administration, and this is where you see some of the things that we have today, and it's a result of FDR and his New Deal. It establishes minimum wage. So the government says, okay, if you are going to hire somebody, you have to pay them a minimum amount of money. It also reduced the number of hours a week people had to work. So again, factories can't take advantage of people and say you have to work 70 hours a week. So again, it reduced the number of hours and it ended child labor. There's also the Truth and Security Act, which helped control buying and selling, so people aren't speculating. People aren't just buying and then quickly turning around and selling, because that does not create a stable economy. All right. Then the government also came up with this Tennessee Valley Authority. And if you see, I have a map of Tennessee, and this is the Tennessee Valley Basin area. And what the government was doing was they were building these dams, and they had these projects to control flooding and to save the soil and to make electricity. Because believe it or not, a lot of people by 1930s did not have electricity. So again, this was one of the government projects to give people jobs and to help people's homes from getting washed away by rivers and floods. All right, so part 2 will be the second New Deal. So I'm going to stop it right here.